paranormal. It surrounds us. It's everywhere. Tonight, you will hear from the people who live and work within these highly active locations, all in the efforts to discover America's most haunted. With your host, ghost hunter and author, Dan Terry.
Good evening, boys and ghouls. I am Dan Terry, your ghost host with the most haunted, right here on the UNX Network, which should be your home for paranormal podcasts because we've got the best. Now, usually I'm hitting the ghosts pretty heavy, but tonight's going to be just a little different. And I want you to imagine you're about to die. You die. And it's a natural death. It's easy. You feel the life slipping away. You maybe see the light, or as the synapses of your brains are firing, you see family members waiting for you on the other side. There's so many different stories about this. Maybe you see a tunnel zooming by with pictures of your life. There's so much that comes back from people who've had near-death experiences. Is it real? Well, tonight's guest, who is a Oxford and one of the other big colleges, I'm sorry, I can't remember now, but he is really well-known. Gregory Shushan is a PhD. He's an award-winning author and is a leading authority on near-death experiences and afterlife across cultures. And it's amazing how different cultures have many of the same traits as they are slipping away or passing on. The main two books he's written, and he has written more, Near-Death Experiences in Indigenous Religions and The Next World, Extraordinary Experiences of the Afterlife. So rather than talking the ghosts, we're going to be talking about what really happens at the moment of and after death. Gregory Shushan.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, thank you. It's amazing having someone with your credentials on here. It's incredible.
Oh, thanks.
So let's start out with near-death experiences from historical point of view, because this has been going on longer than printed books and television shows, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the term near-death experience was coined by Raymond Moody in 1975. He's kind of the father or the grandfather of near-death studies in the modern world. And a lot of people just kind of think that that's where near-death experience, or NDEs as they're commonly abbreviated, people think that's where they date to. A lot of skeptics think that they're kind of an invention of the contemporary Western New Age or psychology world or whatever that Raymond Moody was in. I mean, he was a psychologist rather than a kind of New Age spiritual type. But he sort of discovered these kinds of experiences. But they were known long before that. There's a really interesting book from Germany called "To Die Is Gain" by Johann Christoph Hamp, and he wrote it at the same time as Moody, and they didn't have any knowledge of each other, across between Europe and America. But came to similar conclusions. Hamp's book, he's a German Lutheran philosopher, so a totally different kind of take on it.
One was a psychologist, one was a religious person.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And he, so his approach to it was to kind of look at the philosophy of it and what does it mean for, our life on this earth, and what does it mean to die while you're still alive and come back, and all these kind of philosophical speculations about it. Whereas Moody was are these experiences real? Are they genuine experiences of an afterlife? So I got interested in the idea that what was going on with NDEs and near-death research before Moody, because obviously, if he discovered them, they didn't just suddenly spontaneously appear in 1975, or his, one of his accounts that spurred him on was from 1940s George Ritchie, the famous account. So I just kind of started thinking like, what examples of near-death experiences can I find going back into history?
And you went back to and I'm going to butcher this name too, Squosockton.
Yeah,
Am I close?
yeah. He's an interesting case. This is a Native American example. Let me find it so I don't actually butcher the example. Well, it's I think it's in my other book actually. But yeah, he was a Native American who had a near-death experience in 19th century, and it kind of had a lot of very specific things to Native American cultures, but also things that were generally similar to near-death experiences. So, leaving the body and seeing ancestors in the other world, meeting a spirit being, coming back to the body, and all these other kinds of very typical type of experiences.
Did he say anything about the spirit being telling him he had to go back like so many others?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing actually. In fact, that's a good way to kind of get into the cross-cultural differences and similarities, because in a lot of cultures, well, the kind of typical Western example that we're familiar with, the spirit, the being of light, or the relative that you meet in the other world says, you need to go back because you need to take care of your loved ones, or maybe you didn't fulfill some particular goal that you had in life that you wanted to do. So there's always like some certain reason that's about development or helping other people. Whereas in some other cultures, it's either like, for example, in China and Japan, it's often a case of mistaken identity. So they will say, if I die and I went there, they'd say, we got the wrong Gregory Shushan. We were looking for the one who lives in this village in Iran or whatever. So we're going to send you back, and you go back to your body, and then we're going to go get this other guy, and then the other one dies, and I come back to life.
I have never heard that one before. Amazing.
Yeah, it's like mistaken identity, NDE, which is interesting because obviously the theme of dying, having an experience in the other world, and coming back to life is the same, but the reason for being sent back is obviously a very culturally different thing.
Okay, that's just kind of a shock.
Yeah.
Assuming the gods make mistakes.
Yeah, or often it's blamed on a bookkeeper, the whatever, like, minor god or deity who's the one that's responsible for keeping track of all the deeds that you did in your life, and whose time it is to die and all that sort of thing.
That's just strange. Okay, and what about the other cultures? I know you've done indigenous cultures all over the world.
Yeah, I've done my second book, Near Death Experience in Indigenous Religions. I looked at African, Native American, and Pacific, tribal societies going back to 1600s.
Okay.
My first book, called Conceptions of the Afterlife and Early Civilizations, I looked at the ancient Near East, so Sumer and ancient Egypt, and then I looked at ancient China, India, and Mesoamerican civilizations of the Maya and the Aztec. So and the interesting thing there was that was a kind of different approach, because the early uses of writing weren't they didn't have like personal diaries or newspapers or the Weekly World News or whatever. They just had, writing was really basically religious or accounting, government bureaucracy, and that kind of thing. So for the most part, in those early civilizations, it was a matter of looking at their descriptions of the afterlife in their religious texts, and then trying to see how much they corresponded to near-death experiences.
Did you find anything? And I know you're a specialist in ancient Egypt, and it just seems odd that what would happen? Did some Isis or Osiris say, you're wasting your time with this big pyramid. It doesn't matter. What would they be told at that point? Or is there any record of that?
You mean of people who are actually building the pyramids, what they were told by?
Well, any Egyptian that went at that time and
Oh, right.
didn't, and, came back.
Yeah, I mean, there's no real account of somebody who an actual person who dies and comes back to life.
Okay.
There's a couple of stories, like that are kind of like fictional short stories a little later on in Egyptian history,
Mhm.
about a magician who goes to the other world, and it's not clear if he goes there in his body. It's kind of like an Arabian Nights type tale. Um, but in the actual afterlife text, like the Book of the Dead is the most famous
Mhm.
one, but there's also the coffin text and pyramid text. They they're designed to help the soul know what to expect in the other world. So not only like to read it and be prepared, but they're engraved all over the insides of coffins and pyramids and everything like that to
Mhm.
protect the soul of the mummy who's traveling to the other world. And in those texts, it describes the person leaves the body, they travel through darkness in the form of like caves and underground passages. Um, they reach a barrier, some kind of a series of gates that they can possibly pass, but are possibly going to, they're not going to be able to get through, depending on their level of knowledge about the other world.
Okay.
And then there's a being of light in the form of the sun god, and they meet deceased relatives. Their ancestors are there.
Mhm.
The sun god assists in a sort of life review, where your life flashes before your eyes, and they have a kind of evaluation of all of the earthly deeds that happen to them. And then the soul is the text says that the soul is Osiris, and Osiris is the god of the dead,
Mhm.
and the soul encounters Osiris in the other world as a corpse who's lying there decomposing, basically. So that to me is a symbolic kind of a symbol of the near-death experiencer leaving the body and seeing their corpse lying there. And in the text, it actually says the acknowledgement, the understanding that that corpse is you, is what will allow you to proceed to the next level of the afterlife. So,
Okay.
so you can see how these are like the main religious beliefs of ancient Egypt, but to me, they obviously incorporate near-death experiences into those afterlife ideas.
And they kind of follow along, with the tunnels of light, the luminous being, with what people report today or what they
Yeah,
reported 100 years ago.
yeah, that's exactly it. So you've got to, in Western societies, people will meet a being of light. If you're an atheist, you'll come back and say, I saw a being of light. And if you're a Christian, you'll come back and say, I saw Jesus. And
Mm.
if you're an ancient Egyptian, you'll say, I saw the sun god Re. So it's
So
um,
it all falls with what they were raised with, I suppose, or
exactly,
what
yeah.
they believe. And just maybe there's no answer to this one. Did the peasants, the little people who built the pyramids, the slaves, did they have that kind of greeting on the other side, or do we know?
Yeah, we wouldn't know that. The interesting thing about that is the earliest times of Egyptian history, with the pyramids and all that, when the pyramid texts were written, they're just addressed to the king. So the pharaoh. So we're not sure if only the pharaoh was believed to have an afterlife and therefore to
Mhm.
have experiences like NDEs, or if it was also other people also believed in the same kind of thing. Um, what's really interesting about that though is as time goes on, the coffin texts come out and they're more widely available, but seem to be still for the elite. So
Mhm.
they're on coffins, and they're for people who can afford to have these coffins prepared in these elaborate ways with paintings and hieroglyphic text written on them. But then still, the little people, we're not sure if they get that benefit in the afterlife or not because they can't afford to have coffins painted for them. Um, but then later, anyone who can afford a piece of papyrus or even a broken piece of pottery can have those spells inscribed on them. But the
Okay.
interesting thing about that is that as time progresses and it goes from pyramid text to coffin text to the Book of the Dead and then the later ones, um, there's more and more descriptions of the threats of hell and the promises of heaven, especially with an emphasis on hell. And I think that's because the ruling elite are at that point saying, okay, the more people have access to these beliefs and to these afterlife experiences, we need to kind of keep them in line by teaching them that if they don't behave, here are all the torments that they're going to suffer in the other world. So it went from being like this, idea of spiritual progression and the king becoming one with the gods to being a tool of control of, the populace with the threat of hell and the promise of heaven.
I've often wondered about that in all religions, but okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
It
Yeah. I
makes
was going to
sense.
say, and that can, that's mirrored in Chinese religion. It happens there as well. It kind of starts out as a more, I want to say, pure kind of spiritual experience, and then gradually evolves to like these, almost loving descriptions of all the torments that people are going to suffer. Yeah, and it could be found in Christianity and other religions too. So.
Okay, moving up a little bit to the 1930s, you had an English woman who described it. Now, that should be something we could understand in this
Right.
day and age.
Right. Yeah. There's quite a lot from the 19th century, the 1930s. I mean, the more you look, the more you find of these kinds of experiences. And one of the interesting things about it is that why didn't people recognize and acknowledge them before? Which I think is a
Yeah.
kind of, it's a glaring question because, for example, looking at the Society for Psychical Research in London, which I'm sure you know about, their whole focus was on mediumship and contacting the dead through mediums and getting evidence of an afterlife through, psychic mediums, or also getting physical kind of evidence, like through ectoplasm or with the medium actually speaking in the voice of the spirit or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And within all this, there's an occasional reference to somebody who had a near-death experience. So, like Frederick Myers, who's one of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research, he kind of almost casually mentions a few examples of near-death experiences that he found, but it's almost like because he has to note them. He found them, so he's gonna make a note of them.
Right.
But why didn't they follow them up? Why didn't the NDE path become like a big feature of psychical research? And it may be just because they were so focused on the mediumship.
Or could it be that when people died, they were buried and they didn't actually die? I mean, there's so many coffins been dug up from that time period with scratch marks on the inside because medicine was so bad.
Yeah, that's a good point too. And in fact, the more the more resuscitation medical technology improves, it's obvious that the more NDE accounts we're going to have. So,
a family member of mine passed away on the operating table, was brought back, and was very disappointed because she didn't see anyone.
right.
Does that happen often where people are upset because they didn't have an experience?
Yeah, that's one of the mysterious things about NDEs is they estimate something like 15-20% of people who temporarily die and come back have them. So what about those other 85-80%? Does that mean if they were truly to die, if they were to stay dead, they wouldn't be going to some other realm and having these experiences? So do only 15 or 20% of people survive death? Who knows? And what happens to the rest? And that kind of brings up, the more common subject on your show is, do they stay on Earth and become ghosts, or do they reincarnate, or what happens? Who knows?
So going back to the 1930s and this lady, what did she claim she saw or experienced?
I'm trying to remember that specific one. I mean, I have literally hundreds of these accounts from around the world in my head. So,
well, just pick one from the time period. Is it what we read about today with the tunnel or the bright light or somebody waiting, family members, whatever?
Yeah, it's interesting that a lot of the Western accounts, there's actually one that I'm thinking of from the 17th century. Her name's Anne Atherton. A lot of them include more typically contemporary Western things, the kind of things that we're familiar with a near-death experience. So, leaving the body, often seeing the body lying there and thinking, how strange it is that that's me, but yet I'm looking at myself from this other perspective. And then going to the other world and seeing different kinds of relatives or other kinds of spirit entities that either identified as God or otherwise, and then they're told, to go back to their body. There's one really interesting example of a Mormon guy named Walter Monson, and he goes. This is in the 1920s, I think, in 1923. He goes to the other world, and he is told by one of his children who died before him that it's not yet his time to die, and that first one of his other children needs to die because this one kid in the afterlife was missing her brother, and then I want mommy to come, and then it's grandma's turn, and then it'll be your turn. So he comes back to life, and sure enough, his child died first, and then his wife died, and then the grandmother died. So it happened, exactly as predicted by his kid in the other world.
And was that documented, that he came back, said that, and then they died in that order?
It was, yeah. He wrote about it when he returned, and
Okay.
and then this happened. So
that's kind of strong evidence. It's not perfect, but it's pretty strong.
Yeah. And then another type of evidence that I think is really compelling is when somebody meets a relative or a friend or whoever in the other world and comes back and finds out that person died, and they didn't even know that they had died.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, the person that they met in the other world died at the same time or before they did, and they were able to confirm it when they came back. And sometimes it's somebody that they didn't even know, or a distant relative or something.
Okay.
And they'll say, I saw Uncle Joe in the other world, and then Aunt Martha says Uncle Joe died last night. That kind of thing, which is to me, that's inexplicable, really.
Mm-hmm.
Than that they really did meet this spirit. It could, the skeptical response is it's anecdotal, meaning it's not, you can't be repeated in a laboratory setting or whatever, but it's still anecdotal evidence that's requires some explanation. You can't write it off just because it's not replicable in a laboratory.
All right, how do I say this? UFO sightings change with what television or movie shows come out. So do ghosts become demons because The Exorcist came out.
Yeah.
When these movies and TV shows start hitting, which they did back in the 80s, really?
Yeah.
Did the kind of experience change?
That's a really good question. I'm thinking like Flatliners and that kind of movie. I think Raymond Moody's book had such a deep impact on people. Even though he wrote at the time, there is no near-death experience that includes every one of these elements that I'm describing. Still, in the popular imagination, it became like this set composite experience, and people kind of judge them whether they had, oh, did you really go through a tunnel? Did you really see a light? And if you didn't, then were you really dead? And I just think it's really difficult to evaluate NDEs by the content rather than the fact that you just had this experience while you were apparently clinically dead.
Okay.
So I'm not sure it's possible to track those kind of changes in that period of time.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that's interesting is in the late 80s and early 90s, there was a study by Kenneth Ring, who's a pretty famous near-death experience researcher. And he looked at examples of people getting prophecies in the other world, where they would be told, you need to go back and tell people on Earth that there's a global catastrophe coming. And it's either going to be a nuclear war or some kind of climate catastrophe or something. Mm-hmm. It's going to wipe out a massive part of the population. There's going to be this, descent into chaos. And then eventually we're going to emerge from it and come out into a golden age, and the world is going to be wonderful and everyone's going to get along and all this stuff. And they said that this was going to happen in the late 80s or the early 90s. And most of them said 1988 for some reason. This was like the kind of main date. And then, as if that's not weird enough, in England, and in the UK, there was a researcher named Margot Gray, and without even knowledge of Kenneth Ring's study, she found the exact same thing. People in the UK were prophesying the same thing with the same dates, 1988 being the most typically mentioned date. But then, of course, none of it came true. We're not in a golden age, unfortunately. And so how is that explained? You've got the Mormon guy on the one hand who's coming back with this prophecy that seemed to come true, and then you've got these other people with these prophecies that obviously didn't come true. So it's a little I don't know how to explain that.
I've been, as I do this show, finding more and more blending of all the paranormal, or in your case, scientific things. But I recently noticed back in the 50s and 60s, people who claimed they were taken by aliens had exactly the same message.
Right.
Catastrophe, you'll come out stronger, but millions will die, all this. Is this something cultural that, people are expecting the apocalypse?
I think it's a human thing. That's also found across cultures. But I think it depends on the kind of, social psyche, the fabric of society that's going on in whatever times. So there's a great example with near-death experiences, for example. In the 19th century, when Native Americans were kind of, culturally under threat, their resources had been taken by the U.S. government, by successive European conquerors, the Spanish, the French, the English.
Yes.
They had these diseases, and they were, children being taken and forced into Christian schools, all this kind of stuff. Their culture was completely under threat of annihilation. And we get Native Americans who have near-death experiences and come back, and they say, in order to renew our culture, we need to start getting along with the white conquerors and cooperating with them, and because otherwise we're going to die off. Other Native Americans had near-death experiences where they were told, you need to fight against the white people. You need to rebel against them. So, for example, I'm in New Mexico, and there's a famous pueblo called Taos Pueblo, which is one of the most
been there.
Right, yeah,
it's incredible,
continuously inhabited sites in the U.S. And they had a Pueblo rebellion in the 17th century at some point, and it was instigated by their leader, a leader from Okeowinge Pueblo named Pope, and that was because he had a near-death experience, and he was told to actually rebel against the Spanish and to have a revolution. And then this is mimicked and repeated through, I don't know, a dozen Native American NDEs where they have a near-death experience and they come back and they're told this. And I think what's going on partly is the theme of a near-death experience is you die and you go through this extraordinary transformative experience and you come back to life a different person. So a lot of people say, I'm more spiritually minded, I'm more charitable, I'm less materialistic, whatever. And they're kind of renewed. So I think what's going on with the Native American ones is like, it's a macro kind of symbolism of that. So they go and they're told the culture needs to be renewed. That person who has the NDE is almost dying and coming back on behalf of the whole culture, if you know what I mean. And so he needs to bring back these messages of renewal and revitalization into the whole society.
But from what you're saying, this guy may come back saying the spirits told me we have to fight, and this one over here is saying we need to work with them.
Right.
Which is it? Are they getting different messages, or is it depending on their personal opinions or experiences?
Yeah, that's the question. As you know, there's also the question of whether they were even genuine NDEs. I mean, there's one example that obviously wasn't. I can't remember his name, but he was also Native American, and he was obviously just an opportunist because he said he died and met Satan, and Satan told him that he had to dominate these people, and he needed a certain amount of women to come in. They're just like completely, and they had to give him money, exploiting the whole idea. So he obviously heard about NDEs and heard that they had some kind of, they gave him like spiritual authority to prophets, and that he could capitalize on that. But I think the partly the more elaborate they are, and also the more idiosyncratic they are, the weirder they are. That kind of raises my skepticism about whether they were true or not.
So you would say there's like an average that is more believable than the crazy ones.
Yeah, I think so. If they deviate too much, then I get a little skeptical. But even that's difficult, because you get you get some, for example, medieval European NDEs. There's dozens of them, usually happening to monks or nuns, and they often read a lot like an NDE. So they have the very typical things I've mentioned. Leaving the body, seeing the body below, going into darkness, meeting the god who's radiating light, the deceased relatives. But then, like, there'll be a tour of heaven and hell, where they also meet a saint, like Dante's Divine Comedy. He'll kind of take them through and show them all the suffering and all the different levels of heaven and hell. And some of them, go on to like 20, 30 pages, and they're just not believable at that point. But it does seem like there was a germ, like maybe some core experience that really did happen. And then when it got into the hands of the church, they thought, okay, this is a good teaching tool. We're going to kind of elaborate on this and invent that. And
again, I've always wondered if a lot of our religion isn't that exactly. It just, that makes so much more sense. Yeah. While we're on the topic, I did read of a fella. He was a lifelong atheist, apparently a very nice guy, a school teacher, very well loved, passed away in a hospital. I want to say he was in France visiting, and he was actually ended up being almost dragged to hell. Something stopped the demons first. So we had an actual negative rather than a positive experience. Yeah. And how many of those have you come across? Is there a lot more of those than we think?
There might be more than we think, but there's still not that many. There's still definitely a rarity with NDEs, even across cultures. I've found really such a minor number of them that it's pretty significant that there are so few, actually. And there's also some kind of theory around them that they don't seem to have the same kind of consistency as the more typical positive NDEs. They seem to be more specific to the person having them, more confusional. Some people think that they might be basically a typical NDE, but the person is so afraid and in such a negative, despairing state of mind because they're dying, that they interpret or experience the whole thing in a negative way. So, the going through the tunnel might be terrifying because of the darkness, rather than like exhilarating. Coming into the light, it might be this, blinding, terrifying thing. The being of light might be oppressive. So it could just be the same thing, but people are experiencing it in a different way. Okay. But there are negative afterlife beliefs around the world too. There's kind of hellish types of punishments and realms of despair that they might be based on negative NDEs too, for all we know.
Have you talked to these? Do you talk to these folks, or do you just take the stories and collate them?
I pretty much only work with historical accounts.
Okay.
Because before my work and the work of a few others who've gone into the historical stuff, like Alan Kelly here and James McLennan or two, Jenny Wade did Native American stuff. Before that, it was really just like nobody thought about it. Like NDEs were just a thing that people have, and by people they meant Westerners and with a Christian background.
Yeah.
So going back into the historical and cross-cultural stuff is a challenge to near-death experience research. um, for people who believe that they're an afterlife, and for people who believe that they're just the dying brain. So, so to explain that, like, so the materialist, the skeptical debunking perspective on NDEs is that it's like the special effects of the dying brain. So,
Right.
it's a lack of oxygen to the brain, or it's too much oxygen to the brain, or it's anesthetics, or whatever kind of you know theory happens to be popular at the moment. It's always kind of changing. But the essential aspect is that the brain is compromised because it's near death, and so it's producing these special effects, basically.
Okay.
So
I've never heard it called that before, but I have heard it's the dying synapses or the lack of air or whatever.
yeah, exactly. So so for example, there's the most recent one is there was scientists were able to monitor the brain activity of a person who was actually dying. This is just earlier this year, I think. And they discovered that at the moment of death, there's this burst of activity, and that brain activity is similar to what happens in deep meditation states and during dreaming. So they thought, okay, we've pinpointed the NDE, we've explained it, and they said this burst of activity is what's responsible for the life review, which is, the experience during an NDE where your life flashes before your eyes,
Right.
and you supposedly experience every moment of your life. Sometimes they say it's from the point of view of other people, so you feel the effects of your actions on other people. So the problem with that theory, though, is that the life review is actually a pretty rare near-death experience element, even in the West. And in indigenous societies, in African, Pacific, Native American, it's really, really rare. I mean, it almost never turns up. So, so to say that they've pinpointed a physical dying brain moment of the life review doesn't explain why mostly only a few contemporary Westerners have the life review, if you know what I mean.
Right.
So if near-death experiences are universal and they're trying to explain them in terms of a universal occurrence, which is the biologically dying brain, that obviously doesn't work because not everybody who has an NDE has a life review.
Could it have something to do with, again, the culture, the religion, I mean, we've been hearing about the life review for 30, 40 years, but
Right.
did anybody talk about that in the 1800s, early 1900s?
It is in Western, in 19th century examples, it's more common than say in ancient cultures or medieval China or whatever. But yeah, that still doesn't explain. So it is a cultural thing, but that doesn't explain again why it doesn't hold water that it's a biological dying brain thing.
Gotcha.
So,
I understand what you're saying there. Sure.
Yeah.
You also talked about a Mexica girl, princess, something that
Right.
also reported this many, many years ago.
Yeah, that's a 16th century account, something like that. Yeah, she was the daughter of some kind of Mexica royalty, and this was taken down by the Spanish explorer Bernardino de Sahagún, and he was told this account in order to they were explaining their afterlife beliefs to him, and they basically said, one of the reasons we know is because this princess died and came back to life and told us what she experienced in the other world. And he wasn't, it's not like he knew about NDEs. So it wasn't like this Catholic explorer was coming and influencing their beliefs. It was just the opposite, in fact.
And was her experiences more European? Because their religions in that area at the time, some of them were pretty brutal.
Yeah. There was nothing in her experience that was like, promoting human sacrifice or anything like that. It was just it was cultural in the sense that the entity she encountered and the way it was described and the scene she described was kind of more of that time and place, but it wasn't like specifically promoting their kind of religion.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's your work is intriguing. It really opens up a lot of thought on what we can expect on the other side, much more so than my ghost hunting ever did.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I should say too that, I kind of went after the skeptics, but I should also say that it also challenges people who believe in NDEs and think that they really are evidence for an afterlife, because again, people have this notion that they should all be the same. Like even people who have an NDE and they say, "Oh, I had a life review and I met Jesus and this happened and that happened." They think that that's what everybody should have if they have an NDE. Otherwise, it's not really an NDE. Whereas I think that if this stuff is true, we need to kind of take them all equally seriously. So whether that means that people are experiencing the same thing but kind of interpreting it differently, or even experiencing it differently as it's happening, even if it's kind of the same, um, that doesn't mean they're not necessarily true. I mean, so just going back to the being of light is the easiest example. Maybe it is just a kind of being of light, and everybody experiences it through their own cultural symbolism.
Right.
You know.
Well, and I don't mean to badmouth the church, but I've always wondered why you would believe that decent people who never got the chance to learn of Christianity would be going to hell for that.
Yeah. Yeah.
There has to be more to it than just believe me or you're going to hell. That never made sense.
Yeah, and that's the thing. A lot of these really kind of negative and, I don't know, threatening or controlling things from religion are not reported by people who have NDEs. They come back and they basically say love and light. It's almost a
Right.
cliche, but the message that they bring back is, we are not our bodies. We survive the death of this physical body, and there's more to reality than what we're perceiving on this earth, and it's a glorious grand adventure that's awaiting us.
Which that makes sense for the world, even if you never was given Christianity,
Exactly.
or
Yeah.
if you're a believer in whatever religion you're in.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one of the great things, interesting things about NDEs is that it kind of allows people to believe in an afterlife. It's a very reasonable belief because there is all this evidence from around the world. People have been saying it since people have been writing. So it's a rational way to believe in an afterlife without having to believe in all the other stuff that might not sit well with you in
Yeah.
religion. And I don't want to just, hammer too much at Western religions or Christianity because, there's things in reincarnation beliefs that people might
Yes.
balk at and think, is that really reasonable that I'm going to come back in order to possibly do harm to other people or to myself just to learn a lesson? These kinds of, there's always something that doesn't quite sit well.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up shortly. I've got the book. I don't remember its name, but about a little boy who, as he was growing 3, 4, he had terrible nightmares of drowning. He knew airplanes from World War II.
Oh, yeah.
He told him what ship he was on, and actually had a conversation with the person he thought he used to be's sister, and she claimed he was great. Do you find that coming through a lot of these research you're doing?
Yeah. In fact, I got interested in reincarnation cases, again, less from the point of view of like, are they evidence for actual reincarnation? But the ones I looked at was they included what's called intermission memories.
Okay.
And that's where the child describes their past life, but not just the personality that they used to be, but they remember the death of that previous person. And so they remember also the near-death experience of that previous person. So effectively, like, it's the state between lives that is the same thing as the near-death experience, if we kind of accept reincarnation as reality. So I wanted to look at do those kinds of memories of this state between intermission state, do they correspond to near-death experiences? Are they similar to them? And they are. I mean, in fact, they correspond amazingly well. So you'll have there's a case from 19th century Japan, where this little boy remembers not only that he was this particular other person and the identity and that person's history and who they were married to and all that. He remembers that person dying and leaving their body and seeing their funeral from above while they were in the spirit state, going to the other world and meeting the deity and coming back to life and all that stuff. So that to me was really interesting. And I don't know if you can look at that as helping to validate reincarnation or helping to validate near-death experience, or
right.
both.
Boy, that would be tough to link to near-death experience if this kid hasn't died. It's more of a information transfer somehow.
Well, his previous personality died, so
Okay.
so he. I think the idea is that during the state between lives, that's when like your core self, without all the personality and culture stuff heaped on top of you. So it's during that state that you can remember all of your previous lives. So so that's why as a small child he was able to still tap into that memory between lives and the memory of his former personality.
Do you find Christians, when you discuss this, get angry about it? Because neither of these really fit into their beliefs.
Yeah, that's interesting. That it seems like the kind of work I'm doing and the arguments I make, they annoy Christians and New Age type believers, but they also annoy skeptics. They also annoy the kind of scientific materialist types, because I can kind of, I'm kind of in the middle. I don't necessarily believe either way, but I just find a lot of it really interesting and compelling.
But your method of research is very scientific. So
yeah,
why is it? Because of the conclusions that these guys are making on their own?
yeah, it's because I'm because I haven't done this particularly like in an engagement with materialist scientists, but the sort of pushback to them is, if you're not looking at cross-cultural and historical NDEs, if you're basing your scientific theories only on a few Western stereotypical examples, you're not explaining anything except for why this might be happening in the examples that you're trying to explain.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And so it's kind of the same with Christians or any New Age believer or whatever. They don't like the idea that maybe there's the reincarnation accounts are true, or that there's a diversity of afterlives. They don't like the idea that maybe you're not going to meet Jesus, that you're going to meet the Buddha or whoever. So it's I guess it's in a way it's challenging to people, but to me it's more of like, given all this diversity of descriptions of NDEs, of reincarnation, of everything else, what kind of afterlife is conceivable if we just take it all seriously? Because I don't feel like I'm in a position to say, okay, that NDE is true, but that one's not.
Right.
So so I think that if there is really an afterlife, it probably is almost like an extension of the NDE, that it's going to be very much culturally conditioned and kind of created in a way by your own psyche and imagination and the way your mind processes symbols and everything. But that doesn't mean it's not real. It might still be going on. It's just you're kind of overlaying it or clothing it with the system of your thinking.
Well, everyone's paradise is going to be different.
Exactly. Yeah. There was a movie, What Dreams May Come, with Robin Williams.
Yeah.
That's the kind of illustration of this kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. He was on a beach somewhere or something when his particular heaven,
right.
And his wife and child was coming to him as different people, but there was a lesson there.
Yeah. And they even portray the afterlife like, I think his wife was an artist in the movie.
Yeah.
And so he kept seeing it as like, he was inside of a painting, but the painting kept changing depending on his what he was thinking about and how he was feeling about his death and his wife and all that stuff. So that's a kind of interesting portrayal of that, even though it was very specific to this one guy.
Well, maybe they're all specific to that person.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Which, like you said, would upset certain church people and whatever.
Yeah, or skeptics. I mean, there's a guy, Keith Augustine, who's written a lot about pushing back against anything to do with an afterlife. He co-edited a book called The Myth of an Afterlife, and just going after afterlife beliefs. And one of his arguments in a paper he wrote was something like, if there's really an afterlife, we wouldn't expect all this diversity of descriptions in NDEs. And I just think, why not? That's just based on his own kind of philosophical assumption.
Right. Once
Life
again,
isn't
his
the same.
paradise is going to be different from Japan, ancient Egypt, ancient Mexico.
Right. And life isn't the same for everyone on this earth. I mean, our even our basic way of thinking and perceiving is totally different than a villager living in a small community in India who's totally immersed in Hinduism 24/7. So
it all that all makes sense, and I think the work you're doing is incredible because it's definitely going to make people think.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, that's the goal. I mean, it makes me think.
Yeah, me too. I'm going to be working on this one for a while. Gregory Shushan, PhD, and the author of Near-Death Experiences in Indigenous Religions, which that just sounds so intriguing, and The Next World, Extraordinary Experiences in the Afterlife. Where can people get these books and read more about what you're doing?
You can get them on Amazon or any online store where you buy books. The Next World is the new one, and this one, a Near-Death Experience in Indigenous Religions, it recently won the Parapsychological Association Book Award, which is exciting. That's going to be out in paperback next year. At the moment, it's like $110. So ignore that one for now. That goes straight for The Next World.
Go for the paperback.
Yeah.
Okay, and The Next World is basically what we've been discussing, different experiences depending on where you're at.
Right, yeah. It's focus on near-death experience, but there's chapters on the reincarnation, intermission memories. There's also a chapter on mediumship, the same kind of thing, like what are the descriptions of the afterlife in mediumship accounts, and how can we square that with NDEs and the reincarnation stuff?
I have met a medium or two that I believe, but most of them, I don't know. I have a real rough time with anything they tell me.
Yeah, it's a complicated subject for sure.
No doubt. All right. Well, Greg, are you a doctor?
Not a medical doctor, but
Well,
my PhD is in religious studies. So.
Well, I should be calling you doctor from the beginning. You earned that degree, that's for sure. Doctor, thank you so much for coming on. You have given these folks a lot to think about. It's been incredible.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you, and have a good one. Appreciate that.
Too.
All right, folks. Wow. Whatever your belief in ghosts, there's a death involved, and we're all going to deal with it. Now, you can decide your belief. But this is what tells you to look upon your belief. And is it based on religion? Is it based on what other people have seen? Because as you heard, other cultures do it a lot differently and have different experiences. It's really something to consider, to think about, and don't let it keep you up at night. Hey, I do want to tell you my friend and a previous guest, John Russell, just won the bronze. He's a bronze medal winner of the Reader's Favorite. It's an award for paranormal books, I think books in general, for writing with ghosts, angels, and the spirits of the dead. So congratulations, John. We're all real proud of you. That's awesome. For you all, once again, and I'm going to beat this dead horse some more, you need to become a member of the UNX Network and tell your friends whatever you're into, whether it's ghosts, demons, whether it's Bigfoot, cryptids, their near-death experiences is in there. Whatever you're interested in, go to the UNX Network, first page that pops up, go down a little bit, become a member. If you are a member, you get the monthly UNX newsletter for free. You get access to the X blog for free. And let me tell you that blog's been busy lately. We've had UFOs seen by multiple people down in Missouri. We've had animal mutilations. all kinds of stories. And you get a digital copy for free every quarter of the Unex magazine, which these are the covers of some of the most recent ones. There's the most recent. I've got a story in several of them. Sure, there'll be one. Next issue coming out probably in late September or October will be mostly ghosts, right down my alley. So get on there. What are you waiting for? Call your friends, call your people, tell them we need to get on this, because the more of those, the more people we have joining up, the bigger we become, and the more great guests like Dr. Shushan, the more great guests we're going to be pulling in here, because that was intriguing. So for all of you folks, have a great day and stay spooked. Good night.